Talking about his new plan for Afghanistan as well as parts of South Asia, essentially saying that his original instinct to pull out was not the right one. He's since changed his mind, planning something, but exactly what, we don't know just yet. The element of surprise that was mentioned, but we do know, attack we will. That was the quote that was said. I'm going to bring in a political science professor from University of Toronto, Renan, Levine, who just watched this with me. We thought maybe we were going to get a distinct number of how many troops were going to be sent back to Afghanistan. So we were right in that something is going to be done, the opposite of what Trump originally had planned to do. He's since changed his mind, but what exactly will be done remains unclear. What do you think about that?
It was in many ways a very surprising speech, right? Because it was trying to give a history lesson, talking about, well, we are going to recast what victory is. But I'm sitting here and I'm not that young. I remember what the original mission was, and what he laid out sound very much like what his two predecessors said that they were doing in Afghanistan, which was to root out, obliterate the terrorists, and make sure there was no safe haven for future terrorists to launch attacks on Americans.
Now, the big issue that came up for him was the cost of all this, the spending for this war. Him addressing this today, saying that it won't be just the U.S. who's going to pay for it. In fact, he thinks Afghanistan should pay their half as well. What do you make of that?
I think it's farcical. I'm almost without words, because Afghanistan is a poor, poor country, right? So talk about the amount of money that needs to be spent on their own armed forces. No. NATO, and most specifically the U.S., have poured enormous amounts of money into supporting the Afghan armed forces. To suggest that Afghanistan is going to experience some level of economic growth that's going to support any sort of troop surge is, I think, really distinct from reality. Where is that economic? Wars are good for certain short-term investments, but they're not good for long-term capital investments that allow economies to really establish themselves and thrive. And Afghanistan has been more or less at war for 40 years, right? There's really not much going on, and what is going on is very much part of an underground economy that the government really doesn't have sort of direct control over, to the extent to which they tax and then they can spend on things like guns and soldiers' salaries. The U.S. has had scandals because they've literally written blank checks, except, of course, it's not checks. It's, suitcases full of dollar bills that they've just needed to hand out to people in order to keep basic operations of what would seem to be an Afghan government. And it's not really a government that we would recognize here in North America. It's a government that doesn't always have sovereignty in all of its territorial land. And so what they often have to do is essentially buy what we in the West often call warlords, but they have to buy local supporters, and that costs money. And that's not capital investments, that's paying someone to not attack your troops.
So let's talk about the other half of this, which was Trump saying that the U.S. will no longer be nation building, or they're not going in there to nation build, which in the past has sort of been part of the plan to aid in that. How is this a shift from history?
Well, I'm scratching my head. My colleague Janice Gross-Stein wrote a great book, is what we political scientists like to call policy drift, right? You go in saying, this is what we're going to try to achieve here. Limited action, try to knock out the Taliban. And then the next thing you know, what are you doing? You're, making Afghanistan ripe for democracy. Mm-hmm. And the problem, policy drifts happen for a number of reasons. But the problem that I think is laid bare in this speech tonight is that if you're going to talk about eliminating safe haven for terrorists, well, how do you eliminate safe haven for terrorists? You have to, change the conditions for these terrorists to have support.
So you can't have one without the other.
But I find it, Afghanistan's not my area of expertise, but I'm sitting here scratching my head saying, I don't know how this is going to be achieved. And I think a lot of Americans sense that, because I think they're going to say, wait, we've heard a lot of this before. And I think the big weakness in this speech that had echoes of the famous Gettysburg Address, right? The dead shall not die in vain, is at the beginning of the talk and at the end was very much an emphasis on soldiers dying. That would not have been my framing strategy. I think I would have been framing about sort of the end goals, the outcomes, and instead he's talking, I mean, in many ways, he seems to be preparing America for the inevitable loss of life. And I don't think that that's going to be an effective way for President Trump to gain much support for this initiative.
Let's talk about that support he needed today to go well, especially after the last week, especially after the flip-flop. Maybe some of his supporters not comfortable with that. How do you think this went overall?
Well, I think there's going to be some Republicans in the Senate that are going to be saying, well, it's about time. But I think there's going to be a number of other Republicans, and certainly the Democrats, who are going to say, well, you said we're not going to have a blank check, but there's no timetable, no details. That sounds to me like a blank check. Like, what are you going to need to ask us, because Congress, we're in charge of the purse strings. We have to authorize a budget. So you need to tell us we're going to have this amount of troops. It's going to cost this much money. If you don't give us those details, then it's as if we're giving you a blank check, and we don't trust the president in general, and we certainly don't trust you as commander-in-chief to give you that blank check. So I think he's going to be met by a lot of skepticism, and not just from Democrats. I think there's going to be a lot of Republicans that are going to be very hesitant about signing off on this new initiative.
Speaking of that initiative, part of it is to move into Pakistan and tackle the terrorism happening there. How do we think that is going to affect that region, and how will that have a play on other areas in South Asia? India was mentioned. What do we think how will that affect the relationship, I guess?
I see this speech falling completely flat in Pakistan. I've never been to Pakistan. I'm not an expert on Pakistani public opinion, but it seems that pretty much anyone, perhaps other than the people who helped President Trump write this speech, would have said, wait a second here, if you're going to elevate Pakistan's big enemy, India, and you are going to say that we are going to violate your sovereignty, and we are going to go in, or we are going to push your government to do things that historically it has at least somewhat or tacitly resisted, especially when the U.S. has pushed. I mean, one reason why we've never heard much talk like this vis-a-vis the Pakistani government is that the more explicit the push from the American government, the more a government, whether it's Pakistan or many other governments around the world, will explicitly push back and say,
Korea.
yeah, what do you mean you're going to dictate what we're going to do? I don't think so. You're America, and we will not be bullied by you. And it was sort of a bullying talk. I mean, the threat that he was giving was that he was going to try to elevate their historic enemy. And talk about India trying to get into Afghanistan. Well, Pakistan's going to be very concerned about that. Pakistan's like, wait, we're going to lose influence over Afghanistan and give it over to our enemy? And I think there's also some incredulity, because it's like, wait, India is not another Muslim country. What influence are they really going to have in Afghanistan? What's really going on there that he didn't mention at all is Iran. I mean, Iran has been the ones that have been extending influence into Iraq and into allies in Afghanistan. They're essentially picking up a lot of the pieces where the U.S. has left off. Now, there are Iranians that are very much opposed to, like, the ISIS affiliate. But, I mean, obviously they fight ISIS also in Iraq. That was missing in this speech and has me very confused. We live in a world that very much depends on the stability of balance of power. And this is another instance of President Trump disrupting that stability without a clear goal in sight. And I think there's going to be a lot of people in a lot of foreign capitals scratching their heads after this speech saying, are you just laying out a new strategy for Afghanistan, or are you signaling some major shifts in American policy, which could have huge repercussions?
Huge implications. And I mean, that's the question at this point that people are going to be asking. What exactly are you doing? You were not clear in that speech. What was your main takeaway from this?
I'm sitting here taking notes with question marks, because I'm just like, well, you're not... you're make very tough talk, right? Very tough. right? And you can see, I think, from his body language that he felt most comfortable, right, when he got onto that, projecting this macho image. But where are the details? We don't have the details. If anything, the most interesting details for me as an observer of domestic American politics was his signal near the end talking about building up America's nuclear capabilities and its nuclear missile defense capabilities, which, unless we have some interest in sending nuclear weapons to Afghanistan, that's irrelevant
in this
conversation. Yeah.
And where is the money coming from as well?
I mean, does this mean that you're not going to fund this billion-dollar wall that he wants to build that Mexico, shockingly, isn't going to pay for? I mean, we see some classic Donald Trump themes here. Go against and blame my predecessor. That's the biggest consistency. Whatever I'm doing, it's going to require support from our allies, even though we're America and we're talking the talk. But, this foreign cooperation, I just don't see coming.
So what do you make, then, of him, blaming the Obama administration, saying they wasted all this money, and now doing the very same thing, essentially?
Well, I think that's the first part of that is what his base wants to hear and what his base most comfortable with. Because especially after the week after Charlottesville and after those protests and the comments that I think so enraged so much of North America, he desperately wants to pull these people back and remind even a lot of voters who voted for him that are having second thoughts, if not complete regret, that, I am better than my predecessor. And so this, to me, sounds like more echoes of that effort of saying, hey, remember, it wasn't just about the emails. You put me in office because you so hated, like me, President Barack Obama. I don't know how well this is going to go over, because I don't think he's going to be in Arizona tomorrow. And it will be interesting to see, is he going to lay out more details? Was this just the beginning? But if this is coming at the end of a long policy process, I would expect the details to have been there tonight.
And it seems as if we won't be getting those details at all. Him saying, of course, that they don't want to reveal them, so the enemy doesn't know what's coming. I mean, it'll be interesting for sure to see, again, where that money is coming from, what the details exactly are going to be, and where the Afghan government basically stands on this. Will Afghanistan pony up any of the money that he's talking about?
And much of presidential power has to deal with our attention, our eyeballs to what the president is saying. And so we have to think about this in terms of a media cycle or a day. And it's going to be hard to see this speech crowding out what's going to happen tomorrow in Arizona. The president is going to be talking, campaign-style rally in Arizona. Is he going to return to the topic of today, or is he going to move on to other topics? If he moves on, I think we may forget this speech altogether. Or is much of the talk going to be what's planned a huge counter-protest against the president? And so that's going to be an unusual opportunity for opponents of President Trump to insert what they would like to say into this process. And again, I don't know to what extent they're going to respond to tonight's discussion, if any at all, except perhaps to raise questions of, does he really know what he's doing?
Yeah, and will we be getting answers? Thank you so much, Renan Levine, political science professor with the University of Toronto. We appreciate having you here.
Thank you.